Good evening. Welcome to the November edition of Operation City on the Hill. I'm your host, Robert Maynard. Tonight, the title of tonight's show is going to be The Revolt of the Public in the Crisis of Authority. Basically, this is the title of a book by a geopolitical economic trends forecaster. His name is Martin Gurri. He's wrote this book, and I want to deal with this because there's a lot of talk in the news about the strength of our institutions. And this is not just a phenomena in America. This is a part of a global phenomena. And some of it, recently there's been a lot of discussion about the argument surrounding the potential impeachment of the President Donald Trump. And for those of us who have been following the case closely, it seems to be a slam dunk issue. So I'm really not going to go into the details of it, but the question in some people's mind is, given the evidence, why is it that such a certain number of the population is still adamantly, I don't care if he did it or not, we're going to support him. And I want to make an argument that there is a deeper dynamics going on here that people are overlooking, and the argument is, does this bode well for our democratic institutions? And I would argue that it might be a symptom of the fraying of those institutions, that those institutions themselves might have some points at which they're fraying that might be partially on the shoulders of those who have created the institutions. So I want to, can we pull up the quote that now this is talking about the book itself, and it's talking about the title of the book. We got the title of this show, we got it from that book. And basically, you have, the first one is, these are a couple quotes about the book, and he's arguing that you have a revolt of the public against what he refers to as the authority of the elite. And whether it be universities, whether it be media, whether the institutions that have long been the opinion-shaping institutions are now being challenged by social media and the internet, and you have these little republics or little areas of pseudo-sovereignty, kind of like their own sovereignty, where they get their own information, they get their transactions going on. And the argument that he's making is that this same phenomena that is causing a lot of people who normally won't have access to the political process to be able to rise up and express their anger, because there's a lot of frustration and anger going on at what the people perceive as elite, what people perceive as, some people refer to what political correctness. And I think this goes on both sides, left and right. I'm not, you have, on the left-hand side of the spectrum, you have people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who have created a populist backlash on the left side. On the right side, you've had Donald Trump, and before him there was Ron Paul, and there was Rand Paul. Ron Paul and Rand Paul were more ideologically inclined. Donald Trump is less ideologically inclined. I think he took advantage of some existing dynamics and basically hijacked it, because he's been a long-time friend of establishment figures, but he's skillfully hijacked a populist movement because he was aware of the angst and anger that people have. Now, I want to talk about why some of that is the case. Now, we've dealt with probably next month we'll talk about the possibility that these new publics or these new entities or new forms of sovereignty and new forms of human interaction is a harbinger of a new form of democracy, rule of the people. And so I want to talk about that later, but that is another issue that I think is we might want to look into. But I'm not going to deal with that right now. I want to deal with the falling away of the post-World War II order, is what I refer to as what people refer to as liberal democracy. I want to suggest that some people see the 19th century abolition of slavery movement and the peace movement that was surrounding that is a more accurate representation of liberal democracy, and then the post-World War II order was more or less characterized by rule by bureaucratic decree. Now I've dealt with this issue before. You had the rise of totalitarian governments as they came into the 20th century, and we overcame them, and the post-World War II order was about creating democracy. The question is, we had a military victory, and we had a victory ostensibly for the forces of freedom and democracy, and we had the spread of democracy. But some people would argue that instead of having the rule of people, you had the rule of bureaucracy. And that's a more sophisticated argument. Some people instinctively feel that you really have the rule of a bureaucratic elite rather than the rule of law or the rule of people, and that there's a distrust for the institutions that have been guiding our paths since the victory in the World War II, and we defeated the forces of fascism, Nazism, and communism. And then supposedly that defeat of those forces was a victory for democracy. Now the question is, was the ideological premises upon which these forces rest thoroughly defeated? And my contention is, not fully. Now when America, and we've talked about this before, put forth its Declaration of Independence to the world, this gave rise to a period starting at the end of the War for the Barbary Pirates, where we reclaimed the shipping lanes, freedom of shipping lanes. And that's about 1815 to about 1915, where 1914, 1950, there was a 100-year period there where you had, outside the American Civil War, you had relatively little war. You had the rise of democracy was pretty much synonymous with the rise of civil society. Democracy was the rule of the people, but government played a smaller role in it than it does today. And you had voluntary institutions, you have civil society. The free trade was not policed by an American military in exchange for countries receiving that umbrella in falling into our security umbrella provided that they support our efforts to contain the Soviet Union, which was basically a lot of the peace that we've had in the post-World War II order came about because you had countries who were able to rise economically instead of through imperial and military activity. China and Japan are two of the biggest examples. But Germany is another example too. And you had these large economic powers were able to have prosperity under this global umbrella that the U.S. created in order to get these countries to cooperate with them in their security umbrella to contain the Soviet Union. Now that order seems to be fraying, and people are saying, well, America doesn't, economically that was never really in our economic interest to, I mean, partially it was in our economic, but not fully, because America depended more so on the American domestic market than it did on the international market relative to other countries. So realistically, it was a security concern for the U.S. And now that the Soviet Union is defeated, the rationale for patrolling the oceans and keeping this global trade order in, and business is falling apart. So you've had some geopolitical analysts, Peter Zeihan being one of them, who's written books called New World Disorder and Absent Superpower. And his argument is that the rationale for America policing the world's oceans is no longer there, and they're eventually going to, that Trump is not an anomaly in terms of maybe his disdain for rule of law, but in terms of pulling back from our commitment to police the world's oceans, that is probably going to happen anyway, regardless of who's president, because the rationale to have all those military forces there no longer exists with the Soviet Union collapse. And so Peter Zeihan believes you're going to have a disorder, that you're going to return to the pre-World War II imperialism. And you're going to have these regional wars, and he's got this dystopian view of where America is going to withdraw, and without America's presence, you're going to have this dystopian view, because this order that we've been having all this time that is cracking up, and it no longer has rationale to be there anymore. On the other hand, you got this Harvard psychologist, I think his name is Steven Pinker, and he wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he talks about the incidents of peace. And if you go way back throughout human history, you go back to tribal times up to the present, you see that the incidence of violence is getting less. And even the World War II and the 20th century totalitarianism is compared to, as a percentage of world population, it's not that big as some of the tribal warfare we've had a long time ago. So he's arguing things are getting better, and some people are saying, well, up to a point, yes, but the rationale for things getting better, is that really, does it still hold? And that's the question that I'm going to, we have this liberal democratic order that through these international organizations that people are questioning, they're falling apart now, and oh my God, what's going to happen to liberal democracy? Well, the question is the order itself really stable? And that brings me back to the crack up of the earlier liberal world order that ended with the First World War. And then you had these authoritarian regimes, and then leading up to this change in ideology, which was already, change in worldview was already in place leading up to that. Around the end of the 19th century, the individual liberty principles that were giving rise to this movement for peace. There was the abolitionists, people who were pushing to abolish slavery, were also pro-peace. They wanted to have peace and without war, and some of them actually wanted to have abolish slavery without having the Civil War in America. And so they wanted to do this ideologically, and they felt that the military victory in that we had, and they enabled us to abolish slavery, overshadowed the moral and ideological argument that needed to be won over, that they were winning over. But then the question is, did some of the ideological justification for the rule of one person over another get lost after the military victory? And that's a good question. But so the dignity of the individual and the individual relationships through community rather than through forced government, through voluntary association, which characterized the order that gave rise to the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. That started to fray, and people, probably Mussolini said it best in his piece, What is Fascism? He said, the 19th century was the century of the individual. The 20th century will be the century of the collective and the state. And basically, he's right. And you had different versions of that. You had the radical version of it that was going to enforce it by military might. You had the communists and the fascists, but you also had another version of it it was more democratic. That what Alexis de Tocqueville talked about in his book Democracy in America is, what is it called? Is something despotism. There is a warm parental type of soft despotism. He talks about a form of despotism. The real threat to democracy and freedom and the rule of law in the future is not going to be the obvious threat of a military dictator like a Stalin or a Hitler. It's going to be the soft wearing away of the will of the people to govern themselves as these bureaucratic institutions play mommy and daddy and take care of them. And then in exchange for taking care of them, you set the rules of acceptable behavior. So instead of shared moral values holding the people together, they're being held together by bureaucratic regulation, or what some people refer to as pure political correctness. The less you have of social cohesiveness to hold a society together, the more you're going to have to regulate it by regulation, and eventually that's not going to work. And my argument is that Donald Trump is a symptom of another problem. You're having a breakdown of this order, and this order was basically based upon the rule of experts. In the progressive movement, you had Taylorists and social justice progressives. The Taylorists were the ones after the Civil War. You had these people who wanted to promote progress, and I've talked about this before. As America was rising up to catch up to Europe as a great industrial nation, so they wanted to have progress. They needed to be led by the best and brightest people who graduated from Harvard Business School and were giants of industry, so they could lead the nation into progress. And you had a lot of restriction of immigration because you didn't want to have a messy society that couldn't be socially engineered by the best and brightest. So that was beginning the progressive movement. Then you had the social engineers with a degree in social sciences and wanted to promote the idea of justice. Both of them believed that their ideas were too important. Their ideas of the utopian society, whether it be a economically advanced progressive society of progress, economic progress, or a socially justice-oriented society, they both agreed in rule by experts, not imposed militarily the way a Stalin or Hitler did, but it democratically brought about. And so a lot of people who, this idea took shape over a period of time, and I've talked about this before, but towards the end of the 19th century, this ideology of rule by experts, rule by the best and brightest, became more and more popular. If you go back and read some of the writings at the time, some of the fascists, people like Mussolini, were actually very popular then among a lot of Western figures because he made the trains run on time and he ran. Oh, okay, I have a caller. Yes, caller, what can I do for you?
Yeah, I got a good call for the host there.
Yes.
Oh, I was wondering, the big thing today is what is being taught in the colleges and universities, and I asked that because some colleges, they have all these protests that this one can talk and this one can't talk, and the tolerance is so level that if you want free press and you want really freedom, you let anybody talk no matter what, but it's not becoming that way, so I wonder what the professors are really teaching and what the kids want to be taught.
Yes, okay, I will address that.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else you want to? Okay.
No.
Yes, he basically, the caller is talking about what is referred to as progressive intolerance. Progressive intolerance is that tolerance for regressive ideas is intolerance. So you have progressive intolerance is that you should be intolerant of what is called regressive ideas. And who gets to decide what is regressive and what is progressive? So a lot of your social theorists in your colleges believe that it is better for society that the right ideas win the day, and so their free speech is only a means to that end. It's only free speech if the right speech is. So this is a problem, and this is something that we're having to deal with. And this is like I said, there are problems with the democratic world order that has come about post-World War II because it is heavily bureaucratically oriented, and the public recognizes this in different, just like the caller says, the caller doesn't identify the theoretical foundations of it, but he points out that you have, in the universities, you have, and I'm not saying all professors are that way, but you have a certain intellectual elite that basically think that certain opinions should not be heard, and this is what a lot of college students are teaching. And this is part of, we're running out of time, but this is part of this attitude of rule by the best and brightest. And democracy is rule of the people, but you really don't have rule of the people. You're electing people to represent you, but then you have these people who administer the bureaucracy of the programs, and the people who are getting elected, they get elected by promising you the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they implement these programs. These programs suck up all our money into them, and then it supposedly helps the people, but really what it does is it enslaves the people, because you have a rule by bureaucratic decree that are unelected. And more decisions are not being made by elected officials, so it's making less and less difference who you put in there, because you have an unelected bureaucracy that are administering these programs and setting up these rules and things like that, and you have more and more of our interaction is through government agencies and less through private voluntary association. So next month I will go into what I consider where this possibly is heading. I think people like Donald Trump is short-circuiting this conversation, because we're seeing this guy as a representative of what's going on. I think he's just tapped into an anger, and I see him as a transitory figure, and who is like P.T. Barnum. He's very good at self-promotion. But I see him as he's also, because of the corruption that has been surrounding him, he's taking the attention away from where it should be. We should be having this debate on the nature of democracy and whether or not we really have the rule of the people and the rule of law, or the rule of bureaucratic experts who are managing programs, because the people are being paid for their votes by programs, and these programs are administered by bureaucrats, and these programs come with rules and regulations, and so they're more and more we are becoming a government that is ruled by bureaucratic decree. In America, in some ways, is less problematic than in places in Europe, but we don't have an obvious dictatorship, but we have what Alexis de Tocqueville called soft despotism, the rule by bureaucratic decree, regulations that hem you in, what you can say, what you can do, what you can eat, what you can't eat, and so it's really not a true democracy, and that's what we want to. The interaction is a large government populated by unresponsive bureaucrats, a bureaucratic structure, the best way for people to interact with one another in the 21st century information age? I don't think so. And this is an argument that we're missing because our politics is so screwed up, and we have right versus left, we have Democrats versus Republicans, and you have you get politicians who don't want to deviate from what their leaders are saying, so they're making this case that things should be as their leaders tell them they should be. So you have party politics, and you have these little fiefdoms, and the loyalty to party and personality is becoming more important to loyalty to principle, and so fewer and fewer people are put their hopes in politics nowadays. So I think that there might be some alternatives coming down the pike, and that's what I want to talk about coming up next month. So this has been Robert Maynard's Operation City on the Hill for the month of November, and I'll see you next month. And next month I'm probably going to talk about the democratic approach in a 21st century information age. Thank you and good night, and see you next month.